Hey guys, welcome to Tyson's Fitness Tips Podcast. If you want to lose weight, increase your energy, improve your health and fitness, and look your best, then you have come to the right place. My name is Tyson Brown. I'm a personal trainer, and my job is to help you transform your body by sharing with you the most up-to-date information on health and fitness. I'm going to distill it all down for you into bite-sized actionable steps that you can take immediately to see results quickly. Now, every Tuesday and Thursday, you can expect a brand new episode, which will be a mixture of interviews with top experts from around the world in the fitness space, and as well as solo episodes from myself, sharing with you exactly what action steps you need to take to transform your health, your body, and your life. Also, don't forget to listen all the way to the end of the show, because in the middle, I'm going to share with you a time-saving tip, and it might just be a game changer. I know you're short on time, and this one can save you a lot of time and a lot of energy. So, let's get into the show.
Sounds perfect.
What's going on, guys? It is Tyson Brown here, and guess what? It's time for another podcast. I'm here. It's Wednesday morning. I'm drinking my coffee, and it's time to record something exciting. So I'm bringing back a recent guest who we've had over a year ago, which is Mr. Mike Nelson. Now, some of you have heard the podcast, some of you haven't, because some of you are new. So for the people who don't know who you are, Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so, that's me. And I did a Bachelor of Arts in Natural Science. I did a Master's in Mechanical Engineering, kind of biomechanics. And then I did a PhD in Exercise Physiology. My main topic was some work on heart rate variability and then also metabolic flexibility, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about today in the topic. And right now, people can find me. Just go to mikepnelson.com. And then I also have a certification that I'm doing, which is just flexdiet.com. So those are probably the main two. And then I work with some clients online primarily now. Do a little in-person stuff here in Minnesota, but not too much. And then I teach for Rocky Mountain University, and I'm a faculty member at the Carrick Institute.
So basically, you're doing a lot of cool stuff at the moment.
Yeah, I get to do a very fun mix of education, working with some clients, and then as we're recording this, I'm actually flying out to Costa Rica to help teach down there for a week. I'll be down there for 2 weeks, so yeah, lots of fun stuff.
Man, that's so cool. And so, guys, the reason I wanted to bring Mike on today is because he talks a lot about metabolic flexibility and being able to use fat as a fuel source and also carbohydrates as a fuel source. And the other reason I wanted to bring on Mike is because I heard him talking recently a lot about, there's the keto trend that's going on at the moment, and a lot of people seem to be jumping on this bandwagon, but I'm not a big fan of it, right? And it does work for some people, it doesn't work for other people, but I don't believe that you should ever cut out a macronutrient from your diet. So I thought it'd be great to actually be able to talk about what fuels our bodies use and how they actually are flexible enough to go between burning fat as a fuel source and burning carbohydrates as a fuel source. And that's why I thought, if we bring on Mike, he can explain a little bit more. So, Mike, the first thing you kind of mentioned when you were talking earlier, you said about metabolic flexibility. So, for people who don't know what that is, what exactly is metabolic flexibility?
Yeah, I think metabolic flexibility is kind of more like a hybrid vehicle where you can run on two different fuel sources, and it can get a little bit more complicated after that. But you can use carbohydrates as a fuel, and you can also use fat as a fuel. And the second part to that is how well you transition between fat as a fuel and carbohydrates as a fuel. So, for example, if you're going to go to the gym, which I know a lot of your listeners do, you're going to lift weights, especially a lower-ish rep range. So you're going to do, let's say, old school Bill Star 5x5 routine. The main fuel during that routine session is going to be carbohydrates. Done, go home, you just hang out, relax in the evening. The main fuel at that point is going to be mostly fat. And again, these will vary widely from one person to the next. There's a pretty high amount of differentiation there too. But the point is that it's to your advantage to use carbohydrates as kind of the higher, more high-octane fuel. But a lot of people are also concerned about body composition. you can then transition to use fat as the main fuel also. So it allows you to get the body composition you want and also kind of maintain your performance, especially if you're doing more of the kind of anaerobic lifting and things of that nature.
Okay, cool. So being able to, I guess, say use a certain fuel source for a certain task is what we want our bodies to be able to do as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, and so if we look at the research, right? So if you were to go to the gym and do some lifting, right? Let's say you're doing around, let's say, the 5-rep range, or you're doing a Metcon from CrossFit or Strongman medley or kettlebell work or whatever, doing a fair amount of reps, the main fuel that you want to use for higher performance is going to be carbohydrates. We can look at a group of a disease population that has something called McArdle's disease. And what that is it's a genetic disease where they can't actually break down glycogen. So glycogen is stored primarily in the muscle and also in the liver, and it's the body's stored form of carbohydrates. What you find in this group of people who are not able to break down glycogen, so they're not able to use carbohydrates as a fuel, their ability to do higher intensity exercise is just absolutely horrible. And again, that's an extreme situation, right? You went from using carbs to not being able to use any carbohydrates. On the flip side of the spectrum, too, I've seen data from, usually it happens in more higher level endurance athletes who are just eating a ton of carbohydrates all the time. We have them do kind of a moderate or graded exercise test, or you stuff this little tube in their mouth and hook it up to something called indirect calorimetry or a metabolic cart. And we can look and see with each breath that they're taking in what fuel their body is using for energy. And as it's at a low intensity, you should primarily be using fat. As the intensity ramps up, you're going to primarily use more carbohydrates. In the literature, this is called the crossover effect. Goes back to Brooks and Mercier in about the late 90s. And what we have seen in it's anecdotal and some case reports is some athletes are just burning a high amount of carbohydrates and have a very hard time, switching down to using fat as a fuel source. If you look at a couple other studies, one of them was by Godecki, one was from Helge. One of them was a study that I did, published in JSCR a couple of years ago. And we just took a bunch of people kind of off the street. They're recreationally active, hooked them up in the lab, and at low intensity exercise, the amount of fat they're actually using for fuel was extremely variable. So like around 20 to 93% difference, which in English means that some people at low intensity exercise are pretty good at using fat. And again, this is just an overnight fasted test. Some people, however, are still, the body is more tuned to using carbohydrates as a fuel. You can't really kind of downshift to use fat as well as a fuel. So we do see a fair amount of difference from one person to the next.
Okay, so just going over that, there's been a lot of research done in what type of fuels we use in different situations. But generally speaking, when it comes to, doing weight training or high intensity sessions or anything like that, we primarily our bodies will want to use carbohydrates as that fuel source. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
And then
if you go the high end, like couple single reps, it's ATP, CP, but yes, carbohydrates are the preferred fuel.
Okay, and then so when we're doing more lower activities, most people, let's say, whether you're doing like an incline walk on a treadmill or whether you're doing, something that's not going to be, I'd say, as demanded on your body, maybe a 5 out of 10, we would say. Anything on that effort level would probably be burning fat. Is that right?
That's correct, assuming that this is independent of any nutrition intervention, which we'll get to. But yeah, just exercise itself, fasted under both conditions, you're correct.
Okay, so knowing that then, and thinking about this, if a lot of people who are jumping on the let's say keto bandwagon, and you went to try and do a high intensity interval training session or a CrossFit session, does that mean that they would not be able to get the best results possible because their body cannot have access to that muscle glycogen?
Yeah. So what you find is, and Jeff Bullock did a great study. So if you look up the FASTER study, and they took athletes who were very keto adapted, had been for a year, I think maybe in a year and a half. What was fascinating about the study is that they did show that they literally rewrote the textbook on how much fat you can derive as an energy source during exercise. So on one standpoint, that's just utterly fascinating, and it's rare that you literally get to change something that's been in textbooks for a long time. The downside, however, by about doing more of a ketogenic type diet is that if your calories are sufficient and we give you enough time, in that study they also measured muscle glycogen. And muscle glycogen was pretty good, so it wasn't absolutely bare low. The issue is more of an access issue. I think I stole this from Dr. Peter Attia, but imagine you've got like this huge semi that's pulling this massive tank of gas, and it runs out of gas on the side of the road. Well, it ran out of gas because it doesn't have access to the fuel that it's transporting. So what happens if you do a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet for a period of time, there's a change in one of the key enzymes, which is called the PDH enzyme, or pyruvate dehydrogenase. You don't really need to know the name, but what happens then is it's harder for your body to use carbohydrates to their highest extent. Now, it is true you will still use carbohydrates, but you mentioned if you wanted to be extremely competitive, right? So if you're talking about being as competitive as possible, trying to get that last 5 to 10%, which in elite athletics is massive, then your body can't access those carbohydrates as well in order to use them as a fuel source. So your muscle glycogen may still be okay, but the access becomes impaired. And in some very cool studies, so looking at metabolic flexibility, I'm like, okay, so how can we get the body to use carbs and how can we get it to use fat? And it's dependent upon what the activity we're doing. So some early studies, which are fascinating, they said, all right, we think this is a limiter for endurance performance. So what they did is they took athletes and had them do about a 6-week adaptation period on high fat. And they found their performance, again, these are more very competitive athletes, didn't really improve that much. So then they said, okay, we'll go out and we'll measure very elite athletes for running and we'll see what fuel they're using. So a study came out last year that said, oh, they're using almost entirely carbohydrates, right? So if you look at someone who's running a marathon extremely fast, they're almost entirely using carbohydrates. One study, they actually blocked the use of fat as a fuel in those athletes and did not see any drop in performance.
Interesting.
That kind of confirms that they're using almost entirely carbohydrates. But then they said, okay, wait a minute. So let's go back to our fat studies. Let's have them adapt to using high fat for 6 weeks. And we think that it's a glycogen issue. So 1 or 2 days before their big event, we're just going to give them just piss tons of carbohydrates. We're going to make sure that their glycogen stores are absolutely full. Day of the race, boom, they're fat adapted. They've got pretty much a kind of unlimited use of fat, even in a lean athlete. And we gave them all this carbohydrates back, so they still have full glycogen. What they found was, performance wasn't that much better. And again, it wasn't that the substrate, the glycogen, wasn't there. It was, but trying to access it, the metabolic machinery to use it at that highest level was impaired by, debate, but single-digit percentages. And so that's a bit of a misnomer, because some people who are very ketogenic for performance will say that, no, glycogen stores aren't impaired. And in some cases, in most cases, that's probably true. But again, it's an access issue. Now, that can be changed. That's not permanent. And if you talk to guys like Dr. Dom D'Agostino, who's done a lot of amazing ketogenic research, we don't really know how long that takes to come back. It may be a couple of days anecdotally, it may be a couple of weeks, maybe long. But it's an adaptation in machinery to break down the glycogen at the fastest rate.
Okay, so what
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think about how we can explain this as simple as possible. So basically, what you're saying is that from those studies that we are able to change our bodies from what type of fuel source it can be used and how efficiently it can be used, but we don't have an exact time as to how the body transitioned. And this, I'm guessing this is just because obviously one would be due to genetics, and two, like depending on the person's lifestyle and what it's been like before. Is that probably right?
Possibly. The answer to that is we don't know.
Yeah.
So how I think of it is, if we imagine a spectrum, and let's say on the right end of the spectrum, we are 100% carbohydrate use. On the left end of the spectrum, let's say we're 100% fat use.
Okay.
The ketogenic diet is kind of oscillates a little bit around that. It's primarily fat that gets pushed through the liver, and one of the byproducts is these ketone bodies that are produced. But it's definitely much more on the fat end of the spectrum. Ketone bodies as a fuel are probably a little bit higher than fat, but not as high as carbohydrate, from the ability to create energy in the fastest rate. A lot of times it's a rate limited. You need to produce energy, and you need to produce it as fast as possible. Fat has the advantage that we have an almost unlimited supply of it, but it can't compete for the rate of force production over and over compared to carbohydrates. So how I look at it is, the harder you're going to go from that one end of the spectrum to the other end, it just takes more adaptation, right? So if we look at the average person to get into what we would call a ketogenic state, a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, right? It doesn't happen in most people instantaneously. There's a little bit of a delay. We need to kind of build up this kind of a metabolic machinery. If we go super far in on the fat use, there's probably going to be something that we need to give up a little bit if we go super hard in that direction. And because the body will generally preserve things that are always being used. So if we go into a ketogenic state, we're primarily using all fat. Obviously, ketone bodies are produced, and those are kind of pitch hitting for glucose in the meantime. The body's use of glucose or carbohydrates is very minimal. So we're not really running that metabolic machinery much at all. And over time, we tend to kind of lose some of that adaptation. It would be just like if you went to the gym and you said, okay, I'm only going to do bicep curls the rest of the time in the gym, and then, oh, my squat got worse. Well, why is that? Well, you didn't do it, right? So if you're not using it as much, you will generally lose it. So the old adage, use it or lose it, is pretty true. And that's kind of what's going on from a metabolic standpoint.
That's actually a really good analogy you just shared there. Like, it is that use it or lose it. So and this is, I'm assuming, why you talk about becoming metabolically flexible, so we can use carbs and fats.
Right. So my bias is, if you're metabolically flexible, which I would argue is more kind of the, much as I hate the word natural, kind of a natural state of the body. So if you go back to kind of ancestral times or paleo or whatever word you want to use, evolutionary, doesn't matter. Your body is just hardwired to survive. It'll do almost anything it can in order to survive. You can imagine you're wandering through in caveman days and you're trying to hunt woolly mammoth and you're not finding any woolly mammoth. You better be able to use fat as a fuel and still cognitively function. And at some point, you'll actually go into a ketogenic state. The flip side is, if you come across a whole bunch of honey, you're probably not going to pass it up and go, ooh, I'm caveman guy, I'm trying to be keto. You're going to eat as much honey as you can and probably only stop when it either runs out or you're tired of getting stung. But you have to be able to still use those carbohydrates. If you pass out in an insulin-induced stupor, you're probably going to be food for the saber-toothed tiger or whatever predator is coming along. So you want the ability to still use a Again, it's context specific. So if you're walking and doing kind of low intensity work, that's going to be a more efficient fuel source. You can't use carbohydrates there, but my argument is it's probably not to your advantage. If you're going to go sprint after the woolly mammoth to try to kill it, carbohydrates or stored forms such as glycogen, that's going to provide you the highest level of performance in order to accomplish that skill.
Okay. So it sounds like we're a little bit on the same page there, because what I like to think, like you say, it's context specific. And what I tell a lot of my clients is that the days you are training with weights, you're going to be primarily using carbohydrates, or whether you're doing high intensity training. And on those days, I actually had them increasing their carbohydrates. On the days where it might just be some light cardio, it might be some walking, or it might be nothing, I recommend them to reduce their carbohydrates and increase their fats a little bit, because that's going to be their primary use of fuel. Would that kind of fall in the realms of metabolic flexibility like you talk about?
Yeah, I would generally agree with that. I mean, I think trying to match your carbohydrate intake to exercise is a good idea. That goes back to even like the zigzag method from the late 80s, and even go back earlier than that. I mean, a lot of the physical culturists from the 50s and 40s were known to kind of zigzag their calories up and down. But yeah, I would generally agree with that, and that's pretty close to what I do with most clients. I'd say if they're at a intermediate, more advanced level.
It's time for another episode of Tyson's time-saving tips. One thing we talked about in this episode when it came to the keto diet is to find out how you can become more metabolically flexible, right? And when it comes to saving time, there are two different ways you can save time with exercise, and that is high intensity exercise or just walking in general, which is NEAT activity. Whenever you have the available time, if you think you can't make it to the gym today, always aim to just get in some extra steps whenever you can. Now, I know I mentioned this last week, but it's very, very important wherever you can do to save yourself a little bit of time or spend a little bit more time walking. It's going to be so much more beneficial for you. Now, when it comes to being short on time, you need to get in and get out quickly. Aim to do high intensity interval training. You get in there, you push yourself hard for a short amount of time, and you can get straight back on track with getting back to your day. That is your tip of the day, and okay, and then let's try and give some beginners some ideas about how they can start with this approach. What would you recommend for someone who's kind of in those beginning stages and they just want to know, what's the best thing they can do to start losing fat?
Yeah, with that, and I go over this in the certification I did too, which is fluxdiet.com, shameless plug there.
I highly recommend that certification, guys, honestly. I will leave it in the show notes after.
Thank you. With beginners, what I've seen is obviously compliance is going to be huge, right? Your ability to do something day in and day out, that's probably going to be your number one factor. So if we had to pick one thing that they had to focus on, all the people pick from protein. Do a 4x40 approach. We'll take 4 meals, try to have 40 grams of protein each one of those approaches. If you're a woman, you can do the kind of 4x30, maybe knock out a little bit. 4 meals, about 30 grams of protein each. The reason for that is, and then if you're what they should do, but I want you to eat more protein. Right? If I told you, Tyson, don't think of a pink elephant, you probably thought of a pink elephant, even though I told you, don't think of a pink elephant, right?
Yeah.
Your brain is very visually responsive. So if I tell you not to eat Oreos or Ho-Hos or I don't know, whatever food you guys have over there in the kangaroo land, you're going to think of what that is, right? So if I tell you eat more protein, you're like, oh, I think of protein. Oh, okay. That matches with the visual response in my brain.
Okay.
It obviously helps with recovery from exercise. Protein helps with satiety. you're just more full. If you ate like 3 chicken breasts, you're not going to be as hungry to eat anything else. And I usually find that that's probably the biggest tip. In terms of caloric, I'll put some people on what I call just flat macros. So the macros, their protein, fats, and carbs won't change that much with training, just because I'm trying to get them to make better choices, and I'm trying to get them to do that consistently day in and day out. They're not going to be low enough where we're going to see a drop in their performance. Usually they're newer, so their performance isn't as probably specific to fuel source. I mean, they're still learning exercise. There's a lot more motor learning, things of that nature going on too. So I usually find setting protein is going to be the biggest and the first.
Okay, so like you said, you would say four times a day, 40 grams of protein each meal. For guys, that's about 2 palm size, 1.5 to 2 palm size servings.
Yep.
And for women, it's about the 1 palm size serving.
Yeah, and the technical reason for that is if you pick almost any protein source at that higher amount, you'll cover kind of the 2 basic things that you need for a process called muscle protein synthesis. You want to have enough leucine. So leucine is one of the essential amino acids that is kind of like kickstarting the assembly line of building and repairing muscle or protein structures. You need about 2.5 to 3.5 grams of leucine to do that. You also need some building blocks of what you're actually going to physically manufacture. The minimum for that's about 6 grams of essential amino acids. And even if you're consuming something like meat or even 40 grams of a rice protein, or things that can be a little bit lower in those two, if you increase the dose high enough, you automatically cover both of those factors. So you have enough leucine to kickstart the machinery process, and you've got enough of the raw materials to actually do the building and recovery. So that's the other reason for having a little bit higher dose at each meal.
Cool. And I've actually got a bit of a selfish question, which also I teach some people. Like when it comes to intermittent fasting, so you talk about spreading out 4 meals a day. What I do is, because I do intermittent fasting, I do it 3 times a day, and I just have bigger portions. If someone was following that same type of route, would that be okay too if they had less portions but bigger sizes? If it was, let's say, 3 meals a day.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if by intermittent fasting you're saying there's a period of time where you're not consuming any. Oh, I think truck went by. So by fasting, you're saying a period of time where you're not consuming any food. Is that correct?
Yeah. So some of my clients would listen to this. They follow the 16 hours of fasting and 8-hour window of eating.
Sure. Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, probably having a bigger dose during those times, you could argue, is even more important.
Yep.
Because you've reduced your time that you can stimulate that mechanism to a shorter window. Research on it's pretty split. I mean, once you start getting above 3 meals, 4 meals, 5 meals, does it make a huge difference? We don't have a huge amount of data to say yes. I mean, I think probably, but again, it's definitely diminishing returns, right? 0 to 1, massive difference. 1 to 2 meals, probably better, but not nearly as much as 0 to 1.
Yep.
2 to 3, probably better, but again, you're getting into more diminishing returns as you go up. And at some point, if you push that so high, in theory, you can start running into what's called a refractory window. So they did this cool experiment several years ago where they stuck an IV in someone and just ran essential amino acids. And they said, this is going to be great. We're going to turn on muscle protein synthesis. We've got enough leucine. We've got enough essential amino acids. And we're just going to leave that process run to see what happens. And what they saw is after a couple hours, muscle protein synthesis actually went down. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. We have high levels of the amino acids and everything that we need, but the process actually started shutting down. And some debate about how much that actually happens in the real world, but you can't run that process never ending. Some debate about maybe you deplete cellular ATP levels so low, but the takeaway is that having gaps of lower amino acid intake between meals is probably beneficial. So having a dose at one time and then having a period where you don't consume anything and then having another dose appears to be the better way to go.
Interesting. That's very cool. And so, like, thinking about that, like, for the person to focus on, there's a big debate about, like you said, obviously 2 meals to 4 meals, that's where you kind of want to be aiming for, and it's debunking that myth of 6 small meals a day. For a lot of people, the main focus we should actually be focusing on is just making sure, whether how many meals you're in a day, is that you're getting enough protein in. That should be the overall the overall kind of message that we're trying to send here to you guys.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if you get the amount high enough, you're going to cover a lot of factors. So people ask me, like, well, what is a dose requirement? The current literature, probably around, and there was just a new meta-analysis, Stu Phillips helped, and I think Eric Helms and a bunch of other guys, around 0.7 grams per pound of body weight. I guess probably more for American-type listeners. But if you're a 200-pound person, right, you're looking at about 140 grams per day. And that's pretty good. Some of those studies were severely caloric restricted. So I wrote about this in an academic textbook also on protein resistance exercise. In some of those studies, they had 2 groups. They had a low protein group, which is about 0.35 grams, and a high protein group, about 0.7 grams per pound of body weight per day. They slashed the calories 60%, and this is not during exercise training. And the group that was in the lower protein group, they actually lost lean body mass. The group that was in the higher protein intake, and this is not including resistance or weight training, they actually didn't lose much or any lean body mass. So getting protein levels up high enough does help retain lean body mass if your calories are lower also.
So we should always focus on keeping not excessively high, but we always want to make sure when we focus on whatever we're eating, pretty much every meal, just make sure you're having a good size serving of protein to help with the muscle building process, but also to help with repair, and also when you're going to be, if you're trying to lose body fat, to keep the muscle that you've got.
Yeah, I would agree. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you go ridiculously high in protein, so my buddy Dr. Jose Antonio was feeding guys, 300 plus grams of protein a day.
Whoa!
And didn't gain any body fat.
Actually, I saw a study on that. They were talking about people who, when they were in a calorie surplus, trying to gain muscle, that the amount of body fat that was accumulated actually was lower when their protein was higher, when they had a higher protein amount compared to having more carbohydrates or more dietary fat.
Yes, it's very hard to turn protein into fat. In theory, it's possible, but in human studies, we just really haven't seen it. And this is in the study, they had some people drop out just because they were even giving him a protein supplement to make it easier. And he had a couple of guys come to his lab, and he's like, Doc, I can't eat any more protein. And they actually dropped out of the study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting. So, Mike, pretty much what I think we've covered today is the most important thing is to kind of, not get too caught up in all the diets that are out there about ketosis and things like that, but focusing more about getting, like for a lot of people who are just in this beginning stages, is to focus on the protein more importantly than anything first, because I guess that's like it's obviously one of the key macronutrients just for muscle building, muscle repair, muscle preservation, and like a lot more things that happen in the body. But I think a lot of people get caught up in that nitty gritty of what the best type of diet is when they need to focus on some of the other key fundamentals first. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I have some clients who use a ketogenic diet. I don't have anything against it per se. But the first question that I'll ask people is, what is your goal?
Yeah.
And if your goal is to be extremely competitive, marathon runner, strongman, CrossFit, whatever, very, very glycolytic, intense, carbohydrate using exercise, definitely not the first place I'm going to have you start because on the other spectrum. If is more body composition, if you're doing kind of more of a intermediate type exercise, you're not doing a lot of high intensity work, but again, it comes back to what is your goal? What are you trying to do? And unfortunately, I see a lot of people just go, oh, well, I heard the ketogenic diet is great, so I'm going to do it. I'm like, well, and even a lot of the stuff they send me, they're not even really doing a ketogenic diet. Their protein's too high and their fat's too low, which is a whole other issue. But, what are you trying to achieve first? And then trying to match your nutrition to what your goals are in terms of exercise.
Okay, that would make sense. But one big question I think a lot of people want to know, Mike, is will you, is keto better than any other diet? Like, if I was going to do keto versus this versus that, keto isn't going to help you burn any more extra fat at the end of the day compared to another diet if they're both in a calorie deficit. Is that right?
In general, I would say yes, with a caveat. So if we look at metabolic chamber studies, right, you can look up studies that Hall did, which are fascinating, locked people up in a metabolic chamber, did a whole bunch of measurements. There doesn't appear to be a pure metabolic advantage to being in a ketogenic state, at least that we've been able to notice so far. It is true that if people do more of a ketogenic type approach, so they dramatically lower their carbohydrates, usually less than 50 grams, dramatically upregulate their fat, and then protein by sort of physique or bodybuilding fitness standards is usually on the lower-ish side, that they do tend to spontaneously eat less.
Yes.
So they will tend to eat less calories, which, again, will result in body composition changes. So I think that's where it gets confusing. If you do a ketogenic type diet, you will use more fat as a percentage of fuel much higher. You'll also start using ketones and other things. So from a fuel usage standpoint, then yes, you are increasing your body's ability to use fat. Now, you don't have to do a ketogenic diet to increase the body's ability to use fat. You can do a period of fasting and other things to do that. So, as far as a purely metabolic advantage to ketogenic diets, we haven't seen that yet.
I like that answer because, like you talked about from saying that what I found is, when I have a higher fat diet, I just find that I'm more satiated, which causes me to eat less, right? And I think a lot of people fall into that thing too. Like, a lot of people can't stop when they have a certain type of carbohydrate. But some people fall in the other spectrum where maybe they would much rather, they can stay satisfied on a higher carbohydrate diet and a lower fat diet, but making sure, like, either way, it's not ketosis is not does not have a metabolic advantage as to any other diet, because you still need to get yourself in a calorie deficit. But like you said, keto can, especially when you start producing ketones, it actually helps the reduction in appetite. Is that right?
Possibly. I think there was one new study, and I can't think of it right now, that was looking at ketones in terms of appetite regulation.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, based on my anecdotal experience, that I believe that we'll find they do have an effect on appetite, probably being more on the appetite suppression standpoint. That would make sense with where you see ketosis normally showing up, which is more of a starvation condition or a very long fast. I haven't seen a lot of actual hard data on that yet, but I know a couple labs are looking at that. Because what you can do now is you can use ketogenic salt or possibly an ester, and you can take someone and put them in a quote-unquote ketogenic state within about 20 minutes. So you can take a salt, which is BHB, beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is considered one of the ketones. You bind it to a salt, put it in a supplement, someone mixes it up and drinks it, and about 20 minutes later, you can measure this ketone, this BHB, in their blood. You can get some relatively high numbers. You will kind of max out with the salts, but esters, you can get super high numbers. What that allows people to do then is to try to look then at appetite suppression effects of that without really putting people on a ketogenic diet. And you could argue that those may be two different states, and I'd probably agree with you. But as a more simple to run experiment, people can do that. And when I've done that and when I've had some clients do that, most report that they're just not hungry for a period of time. And it's anecdotal. I usually don't see them make up for it in terms of increased calories later. But I think that's a pretty fascinating area of research.
Interesting. There's just still so much coming out in regards to research and everything. Yeah.
And in terms of ketone supplements and performance, it's a pretty mixed bag. There's only about a handful of studies done on that. A couple used that necessarily with carbohydrates. Years ago, Louise Burke's lab went out recently. They both show completely opposite effects, even though they try to replicate each other. So it'll be very interesting to see where it goes, especially with the supplements now, because you get over the biggest hurdle was doing a ketogenic diet for several days, sometimes several weeks, to get into ketosis, meaning getting your ketone levels high enough. And by giving someone a supplement, you can kind of bypass that and artificially raise their ketone levels within minutes, which to me is just utterly fascinating.
I just can't wait to see what they come out with next.
Yeah, and I think the downside of that is that because there is a supplement now, a lot of people can make money from it. So there's a lot of incentive to push people towards that direction also. So it's always a pro and a con to everything.
Yeah, I guess so. And guys, at the end of the day, remember, don't worry about supplements until you've got your diet in check. The supplements will not, it doesn't matter what it is, there's no magic bullet for fixing a broken diet unless the food itself, first of all.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, supplements are just to supplement a good diet. And the advantage that a supplement has is more on the convenience side.
Yeah.
If you look at things like creatine, fish oil, I'd say kind of more of the basic things can definitely be useful. But if your diet is just utterly horrible and you're expecting fish oil and creatine to have a massive difference, then it's just not going to happen.
I wish you told that to my 16-year-old self before I was spending all the money in the protein shop.
Oh, yeah. I remember a buddy of mine, Craig Keaton, said once, he's like, if most people, especially when they're starting out, if they had $200 a month to spend on supplements, if they just took that $200 and actually bought higher quality food, they'd be much better off. I would agree with that.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, I really appreciate you coming on today and just sharing us a little bit of your wisdom in regards to metabolic flexibility and what we should really be focusing on. So before you do take off, can you just let us know where we can find you again, and also the flex diet that you've got going on at the moment?
Yeah, so you can find all the information on me is on the website, just miketnelson.com, MIKETNELSON. If you're interested in the Flex Diet certification, so it's mainly for trainers, but we do have a lot of other people who are just more fitness enthusiasts that have taken it. You can go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com.
Awesome. I'm going to put all those in the show notes, guys, and everything we talked about today. So if you want to check any of that out, make sure to go to the show notes and check it out. And until next time, I will speak to you guys then. See ya.
See ya.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I really appreciate it. Now, I've got a special gift for you. If you want to learn how I managed to lose 10 kilos and keep it off, then I've got the perfect treat for you. I've got a free intermittent fasting cheat sheet that I share on my website that shows you exactly how to diet effortlessly with intermittent fasting and fit it into your busy lifestyle. And more importantly, this is the exact guide that I follow every single day that allowed me to lose 10 kilos of body fat and keep it off 4 years later. So head on over to www.tysonbrown.com.au and pick up your free cheat sheet today and learn how to fit intermittent fasting into your life and diet effortlessly. Once again, that's www.tysonbrown.com.au. Opt in for the free cheat sheet and I'm going to send it straight to your inbox for free. Until next time, speak to you guys then.